World War II made strange bedfellows. The big three of World War II were Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Now, following this on-demand lesson, the timeline of World War II will be discussed. But just to understand World War II and how it lays the foundation of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States will come out of World War II distrusting each other very much. We need to understand that they have different political and economic philosophies. The United States is based on a democratic capitalist system. Now, there's elements of socialism in there where the government will regulate and provide safety net help for citizens. True. But it's essentially a Republican democracy. The Soviet Union at this time was a union. They called themselves the United Socialist Soviet Republics. They're not necessarily socialist. What they are is a totalitarian communist state. Politically, they're run by a single party, the Communist Party, and typically they're run by dictators. At this time, Joseph Stalin, who's one of the biggest murderers in history. Economically, they are a command quasi-communist society. The government controls all the means of production. They tell the factories how much to produce, when to produce, and for whom to produce. There are fundamental issues not only of their political and economic systems, but how the war was fought. The Soviet Union took massive casualties during World War II. They lost upwards of 12 million soldiers, plus 12 million civilians. So over 20 million people from the Soviet Union are killed during World War II. The Soviet Union had asked for a second front all the way back in 1941, 1942, and it takes until the Operation D-Day all the way in 1944 before that second front really comes to fruition. So there's this feeling that the capitalist democracies of the United States and Great Britain were allowing the Nazi fascists to kill off as many communists as possible before they got involved. So if you remember nothing, remember that World War II leads to the Cold War because of all this massive distrust. One of the reasons that the Soviet Union distrusted the United States so much went all the way back to the roots of World War I. During World War I in 1917, I believe, the Soviet Union overthrew their czar and established their communist regime. And in 1917, the United States actually lent support to the opposition to the communists during the Russian Revolution. They had a battle between the Reds and the Whites. The Reds were the communists and the Whites were the supporters of the old czar, and the United States supported the Whites. This increased Soviet distrust of the United States. The American fear of communism was reflected in the 1920s Red Scare and the Palmer raids, and this distrust only grew as Stalin was signing the pact with Adolf Hitler prior to 1939. After Hitler turned on Stalin, though, the United States needed to make amends with the Soviet Union. The enemy of Hitler was America's friend at this time. So we allied ourselves with Stalin, understanding that we didn't totally trust him, and Stalin and the Soviet Union didn't really trust us. Immediately, the United States tried to take advantage of this situation by giving Lend-Lease money to the Soviet Union so that the Soviet Union could keep open that Eastern Front during World War II, while the United States and Britain formed their battle plan for the Western Front. As we go through the timeline of World War II, again, look for moments of distrust or elements that could lead to distrust between the Soviet Union and the United States. As the war raged on, after 1939, after Hitler invades Poland and starts the war, after Hitler turns on Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union becomes allies with the United States and Great Britain, we have emerged what's called the Big Three Allied leaders: Winston Churchill of Great Britain, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Remember that the Soviet Union was taking on the vast brunt of German aggression on the Eastern Front. Between 1941 and 1944, again, they're going to lose overall about 20 to 24 million people between soldiers and civilians, partially because of a scorched earth tactic campaign on the Eastern Front of withdrawing back further and further and further into the Soviet Union. The Soviets wanted the Allies to open up a second front. which would draw some of the German power away from the Eastern Front back towards the Western Front to give them some relief. And it doesn't come for about 3 years. The British, on their part, were facing the Battle of Britain when the United States initially starts to get involved with the war. Again, the Battle of Britain is when the German Air Force was dropping bombs over the major industrial cities in the southern part of Great Britain. So what the British wanted was some help against the German Air Force in the Battle of Britain. So there is this delay of 2 or 3 years, which again further enhances that distrust. There are a number of reasons for that delayed second front being opened up. One of the reasons is that Winston Churchill and the Americans wanted to produce bombers rather than landing craft. The landing craft had to be specifically built in order to land on the beaches and attack the beaches that were necessary. The Western powers, the British and the Americans, did try to open up a second front with Operation Torch. Now, Operation Torch would have gone into northern Africa, and then from North Africa it would have swept up into the Italian peninsula. From the Italian peninsula, the design was to open up the southern half of Europe. So it would have freed the Mediterranean Sea. Now, one of the reasons that this happened was because that the British and the Americans wanted to control the oil fields of the Middle East. It would have ideally taken some pressure off of the USSR, but it doesn't really help all of that much. At this point in the war, we do see that by opening up the second front, which is only moderately successful, the Italians do drop out of the war at this point, but the Germans fall onto the Italian peninsula and really make it difficult going for the American-British forces. It does open up an opportunity for the Soviet Union. The Germans had surrounded the city of Stalingrad, and by pulling some of the forces away, the Russian army is now able to, the Soviet army, is now able to push back against that, that siege. It was a brutal siege over a year. Many people were starving, and it was an incredibly difficult time. But the tide starts to turn on the Eastern Front, and they slowly start to push the Germans back towards Germany. Now, the Americans and the British, by landing in Italy, did open up the front, and it did delay some attack, but it did delay an attack directly on Germany, which is what the Soviet Union wanted. Italy surrendered. The German forces continued to bitterly fight on the Italian peninsula, and the Allies never actually get to push in from the south into Germany. The real second front in World War II opened up with the invasion of Normandy in what's known as Operation Overlord. This is the attack on D-Day. The Americans and the British attacked northern France with a beach invasion. Took very heavy losses, but captured a beachhead in northern France. From there, once the beachhead was established, once we controlled that northern part of France, the United States and the British and the combined forces slowly push into France, liberating Paris within a few weeks, and within months they're at the German border. What this means is that Germany had to engage now in a three-front war. They were fighting the British and the Americans in Italy, France, and the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. So they're diverting military resources to all of these different areas. And really, they're getting squeezed from the east and they're getting squeezed from the west, and both sides are pinching them in towards the capital of Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge is the last major German offensive, and really the beginning of the end of the war. Hitler tried to take all of his forces and attack the western line, which caused a bubble, i.e. the bulge in the line. His hope was to break the lines and he'd be able to surround the military, the British and the Americans on both sides, and thus keep the war going. The line does bulge, but it springs back fairly quickly. This is the last major German offensive, and it really begins this slow march towards Berlin, which is the capital of Germany. The Americans, the British, and some of the French forces now liberated from the west, the Soviets moving in from the east. A couple of interesting things happened with this. First of all, the the British and the Americans get there late. So the Russians and the Soviets actually take Berlin first. This is where Hitler commits suicide in his bunker with Soviets running around him. And it lays the foundation for the tensions after the war because the Soviet Union controls Berlin and takes over the eastern half of Germany, and the British, French, and Americans control the western half of Germany. And really their military doesn't move, neither side, until after the Cold War is over in the 1990s. Up until this point, we've been talking about the European theater of war, the fight with Germany. And we are now going to move on to the Pacific theater of war. Remember that it was during the Atlantic Charter that Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that if the United States were to enter into the war prior to Pearl Harbor, that the United States would focus on Germany and we would sort of set the Pacific theater aside until we had more time. This doesn't mean that we're not fighting in the Pacific, however. The United States was pursuing what's called a policy of island hopping. We would take the weak islands. Remember, Japan is an archipelago and a series of island chains. And in the Pacific arena, they had controlled a number of islands throughout the ocean. So we would take the weak ones, and we'd bypass the heavily fortified islands. Meanwhile, once we took the weak islands, the United States would bomb the heavily fortified islands, or they would neutralize them by setting a couple of ships around them. The goal was to not have too many of those beach storming attacks like what we'd had to do in Normandy. The other goal was to get as close to the Japanese homeland so that we could launch air attacks against the Japanese mainland. And when we had a naval victory early on at the Battle of the Midway, we stopped the Japanese from advancing towards the United States, and we started pushing back towards the Japanese mainland. The goal of reaching the Japanese mainland by air was really solidified with the battle at Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Once these two islands were taken, the United States could get to the Japanese mainland by air and get back with one tank of fuel. Fighting for these islands proved the Japanese tenacity. The Japanese fought until the last soldier was dead. They refused to surrender. They were also very vicious towards their prisoners of war, which made the Americans very concerned about any effort to take the mainland island of Japan. There was fear that it would cost millions, hundreds of thousands of lives if the United States tried to attack the mainland directly. Because of this, we actually asked our allies for support. The United States asked the Soviet Union to assist us with the invasion of Japan since we had opened up the Second Front at Normandy. This was agreed to at the Yalta Conference of the Big Three. They met at a place called Yalta. And as promised, once the European theater was ended and the Germans defeated, the Soviet Union did march into Korea in anticipation of then launching from Korea into Japan. While this becomes unnecessary, it also is one of the reasons why Korea becomes a hot point between capitalism and communism after the World War II is over. One of the most controversial elements of World War II came with the end of the war in the Pacific theater with Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on the cities in Japan of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Truman had taken over as president from Franklin Roosevelt after Roosevelt passed away late in his third term. The decision to drop the atomic bomb came after a long process, and it was viewed as a necessity in order to prevent upwards of 500,000 American casualties that would have occurred in their idea had the United States attacked the Japanese mainland directly. We were also nervous about continuing the alliance with the Soviet Union. Remember, the Soviet Union had taken over the Korean peninsula and would have jumped from Korea into Japan had we attacked through the mainland. The Japanese did surrender unconditionally after the dropping of the atomic weaponry on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was a weapon that nobody had ever seen before, and it was much more powerful than anything anybody could ever have imagined. The dropping of the atomic weaponry really impacts the Japanese culture for generations afterwards. The bomb is also dropped in the Soviet Union's viewpoint as a threat against the Soviet Union, a warning per se. the United States understood that it had the atomic capabilities, whereas the Soviet Union did not. So this was in a sense, a warning against the Soviet Union, a demonstration of American power compared to the Soviet power. So this only furthers the distrust between the Soviet Union and the United States going into the post-war period, and it's one of those things that leads into the Cold War. And what it does is help to foster an arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, which we'll see in the Cold War timeline coming up. World War II had a devastating impact on minorities in Europe, most obviously within the European Jewish community. Germany used the power of the state to promote a racial society based on the myth of the Aryan man, the Caucasian, the white man. Nazi propaganda churned out based on anti-Semitism, which means bias or prejudice or hatred of the Jews. Part of this is based on social Darwinism, which we've talked about a lot in the last few standards. Social Darwinism, this belief that certain people and certain races are more evolved than others. In Nazi Germany, there was an effort to use this pseudoscience to show that the Aryan race was going to be polluted by the Jewish population, therefore should be eliminated. Anti-Semitism was the official policy of the government, starting early in the 1930s with the Nuremberg laws, which eliminated German citizenship from Jewish people living within Germany and essentially made them targets towards anti-Semitic acts. All of this early stripping away of rights culminated with the Holocaust, although that's a big word for a large amount of stuff that happened. Essentially, the final product of the Holocaust is Hitler's effort to rid Europe of the Jewish population. He commits genocide. Genocide is this effort to eliminate a race from existence. Hitler's government used the power of the German state in order to try to commit this genocide. Through the various items that we'll talk about in upcoming on-demand episodes, 6 million Jewish people are going to be murdered. Another 6 million or so of non-Jewish population will be murdered as well, and that includes people like the gypsies, homosexual population, criminal population, people with mental disabilities, and just other minority populations. So in total, the Holocaust leads to the genocidal death and murder of about 12 million people. The United States and the Allies' response to the Holocaust before the war was severely limited. Granted, they didn't know the full extent of what Hitler calls the final solution, or the extermination of the Jewish population. There were signs that Nazi Germany was an anti-Semitic racial state, but little was done to alleviate the suffering of the Jewish population that was there. As early as the passage of the Nuremberg laws, which stripped German citizens of their citizenship and made them really subject to the full power of the state, and events like Kristallnacht, which were in 1938. Kristallnacht means the Night of Broken Glass. It was a state-sponsored attack on the Jewish population. Some 50 or 60, maybe a little bit more, Jewish people were murdered on that night, and another few thousand were deported to what were called ghettos, or walled-off sections of a city, and were not allowed in or out. From the ghettos, they'll be transported to concentration camps. Even with all of the evidence of the Nazi racial state, little was done by the outside community. Remember that during 1920, immigration quotas were passed in the United States, restricting specifically Jewish population and other minority populations from Europe. So it wasn't easy for the Jewish population to be granted asylum. In fact, in one famous case called the Tragedy of the St. Louis, a ship called the St. Louis coming from Nazi Germany went to Cuba and then the United States seeking an escape. They didn't have their visas yet to travel into the United States. And they were turned away, both Cuba, the United States, and I believe Canada, before eventually being sent back to France. And when France was taken over by Nazi Germany in 1939, 1940, most of the people on the St. Louis that had tried to escape were going to be caught up in the Holocaust and murdered in the death camps. Once the war began, there was little military action trying to stop the transportation of the Jewish population into the death camps. The official line from Roosevelt and the administration was that, first of all, they didn't know the extent, plus fighting the war was an effort in itself to stop the Holocaust. But there are a number of people that claim that more could have been done, targeting railroad tracks and such that would have potentially slowed the death camp process. And as the war ends, soldiers started to liberate these camps, and the true nature of the Holocaust becomes evident, which really horrifies the world and leads to a post-war re-understanding of World War II. Once the post-war scale of the Holocaust was uncovered, the United States and the Allies needed to figure out a way to respond to this genocide. Since Hitler had committed suicide in the bunker as the Soviets were surrounding Berlin, he couldn't be put on trial. However, a number of Nazi leaders were captured and put on trial in what are going to be called the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials. Be careful, because this is often confused with the Nuremberg laws, which the Germans passed before the war. In the Nuremberg trials, about 12 Nazi officers and civilians were charged with what are called crimes against humanity. See, during World War II, to kill a Jewish person was not against German law. So what was often argued during the Nuremberg trials was that they hadn't violated any German law. So the lawyers of the war crimes trials that were prosecuting the Nazis argued was that every society has a war against murder, and therefore what the Nazis had done was maybe not against German law, but it was a much larger crime. It was what they called a crime against humanity. Several of the defendants in the Nuremberg trials did try to say that they were just following orders. However, this becomes the basis for, even in the American military, that you have an obligation to break an order that is unlawful. 12 Nazis were found guilty and were executed and were held responsible for these actions. The Nuremberg trials does set a precedence for future war crimes trials, which will eventually be held mostly by the United Nations. However, it has not ended genocide. There's still genocide happening all over the world, and we do try to fight against that. But the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials tries to set a precedent against the Nazis so that we can try to fight and end genocide worldwide. In addition to the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials, the United States and the Allies also recognized that the Jewish population did not have a homeland. They did not have a nation that they could call their own. And Britain controlled a territory in the Middle East known as Palestine. It was their colony, and Britain offered up a portion of Palestine to create a new homeland called Israel. The State of Israel was established after the war, and it became a Jewish homeland. And it's going to cause a number of problems within the Middle East that we'll talk about during the Cold War situation. The big cause of the problem was that the Palestinians living in that territory claimed it as theirs. The Israelis claimed, the Jewish population, claimed that it was the traditional homeland of the Jewish population prior to the diaspora, the spreading of the Jewish population. This causes conflicts between the Palestinians and the larger Arab world and the Jewish population living within Israel, and really becomes a large source of conflict even up until the modern day. What we can see, though, is that the United States becomes an avid supporter of Israel because, in part, of the guilt caused by the lack of any sort of effort to help the Jewish population prior to